Welcome to the 14th Annual Jeanne S. Chall Lecture and Reception. Good evening. I'm Alex Hodges, HGSE's librarian and director of our Gutman library. We're gathered here tonight to celebrate the scholarship made possible by the Chall Endowment. It was established in 1999 to honor Dr. Jeanne S. Chall. She was a leading expert in reading research and instruction. As many of you know, she was a psychologist, a teacher, a writer, and lastly, a professor emerita at HGSE. The endowment ensures that Dr. Chall's legacy of active engagement in reading research is perpetuated at our school and in the wider education community. To all of you, thank you so much for your interest in reading and literacy development. We always look forward to developing a deeper connection to Dr. Chall's legacy. A few appreciations before we get started tonight. I want to thank the members of the Chall Endowment Advisory Board. They are from HGSE, Jimmy Kim, Meredith Rowe, and Paolo Uccelli. From NYU, Kay Stahl. From Boston College, Patrick Proctor. And from Stonehill College, Margie Pierce. Thank you to our colleagues who have made us comfortable here tonight in Asquith Hall, and also later for our reception with some beverages. In particular, I'd like to recognize the work of HGSE's Jody Smith-Bennett, Roger Falcon, and Mayanne Kurvashi for their support of all of the Chall events and planning. I'd also like to thank my colleagues, the HGSE librarians, who worked so hard to provide reading researchers access to the Chall collection. And those include Marcella Flaherty, Carla Lilvek, Kathleen Donovan, Tae Lee, Rebecca Martin, and Karen Young. And also John Collins, who is my predecessor and happens to be here tonight. Let's give them all a hand. So just some housekeeping items. Tonight's lecture will be followed by an audience question and answer session, and then our Chall Awards presentation. And after the awards presentation, I'll invite you to partake in our reception from 7 to 8 p.m. The reception takes place in the Elliott Lyman Room, which is upstairs in Longfellow's Hall's second floor. You'll find the elevator and stairs just off here to your left, my right. Now, to introduce our main guest of honor, Dr. Peter Afflerbach. Dr. Afflerbach is professor of reading in the Department of Teaching and Learning, Policy and Leadership at the University of Maryland, College Park. He received his PhD in reading psychology and his MS in developmental reading from the State University of New York at Albany. His career in teaching began in the New York State public schools. Dr. Afflerbach's recent research interests focus on reading assessment, reading comprehension, and the verbal reporting methodology. His work has focused on aspects of individual differences in reading development that are sometimes neglected in reading theory and practice. Those include motivation, engagement, metacognition, student self-efficacy and self-concept, and epistemic beliefs. He's published in numerous research and practitioner journals. Those include The Reading Teacher, Journal of Reading, Journal of Adolescent and Adult Literacy, Journal of Educational Psychology, Language Arts, Elementary School Journal, Journal of Literacy Research, Reading Research Quarterly, and Cognition and Instruction. Dr. Afflerbach has served on the Standing Reading Committee of the National Assessment of Educational Progress. He was a member of the 2009 NAEP Reading Framework Committee and the Feedback Committee for the Common Core Standards for English and Language Arts. He served on numerous committees and panels for the Program for International Student Assessment, otherwise known as PISA, the National Assessment of Adult Literacy, and the National Accessible Reading Assessment Projects. In 2017, the Association of Supervision and Curriculum Development published Dr. Afflerbach's Understanding and Using Reading Assessment, Kindergarten through 12th Grade, 3rd edition. He is the editor of the Handbook of Individual Differences in Reading, Reader Text and Context. In 2015, his edited volume, The Handbook of Individual Differences in Reading, Reader Text and Context, was published by Routledge. He served as an associate editor of the journal Metacognition and Learning. He's co-editor of the Handbook of Reading Research, 4th edition, with the 5th edition slated for publication as soon as this December. He's also served on the editorial board of Reading Research Quarterly and currently serves on the Reading Teacher editorial board. In addition, Dr. Afflerbach is an author of the Pearson Scott Forsman elementary reading series, Reading Street. Anecdotally, this series is how I know him. It was the most used text set and checked out materials for a teacher collection that I oversaw in my previous education library at American University in Washington, D.C. So I know a number of teacher candidates whose practice has been influenced by his work. Dr. Afflerbach has won numerous awards in addition to all of his publications. His dissertation won both the International Reading Association's Outstanding Dissertation Award and the Literacy Research Association's Outstanding Student Research Award. Dr. Afflerbach has earned awards from the American Educational Research Association for his classroom assessment research and his reviewing in Educational Researcher 2. He was elected to the International Reading Association, now the International Literacy Association's Reading Hall of Fame in 2009. I warmly welcome Dr. Afflerbach to HGSE. His lecture tonight, Teaching Readers, Not Reading, Addressing Students' Individual Differences. Welcome.
Thanks so much. Good evening, and thank you for showing up here tonight. I'm happy to see everybody here. Everything here is so great. You just turn something on and everything shows up. I didn't have to reset my PowerPoint or anything like that or do any mirror imaging. So let me get started by telling you something that I think is a wonderful coincidence, and that is that 40 years ago this September, that would be 1978, I started graduate school, and I was really fortunate to walk into an assistantship that had just been awarded to a few professors at the University at Albany, and they were investigating the reading habits and the reading challenges and needs of the aged population. So I had two things that I did right away, starting in September of 1978. And the first was I went to nursing homes and assisted living centers, and I interviewed old people about how they used reading. And it was, to me, it was just like a fascinating introduction to reading research. It was certainly qualitative. And sometimes I was wondering if the people would ever stop talking to me. But they did, and they were so wonderful, and the stories they told me were so wonderful. That was one half of my charge as a starting graduate student. The other part, and this was affiliated to the grant we had gotten, was about figuring out whether or not United States government forms were accessible to the aged population. And so my professors handed me this stack of supplemental security income, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all of these documents, and said, you just have to figure out what grade level readability these are. So I'm unfortunately not a digital native. This was back in the day where we didn't have computers that would do this stuff. So this leads to my introduction to Jeanne Chall's work. And so if you look at this, this is a page from like my very first publication in 1979 that was in the Journal of Reading. And what you're seeing on this table is the result of my going by hand through all of these government documents and seeing how many unfamiliar words there were in relation to the Dale Chall readability list. So the Dale Chall readability list is one that said, if it's not one of these 3,000 words, it's a little more difficult than the 3,000 words that are on the list. So you can probably tell, if you can read that, Mazel Tov, that's excellent. Your eyesight's in good shape. If you can't, I wish I could offer you a coupon for an eye check for something, but anyway. So this is what we found, and you could imagine the columns on the right, T is total, I is in isolation. Some of these words were very unfamiliar. They don't show up too often in the English language. And what we tried to do was use the results of this to influence government policy and say, could you step back from writing these documents and have somebody who understands readability and reading challenges help inform the creation of these forms. This is like I'm getting misty-eyed thinking back to the day when the government actually wanted to help people. But anyway, so So here are the top 15 words, and I always think about the first time I actually did some reading research, and what a wonderful time it was. And just by coincidence, it was Jeanne Chall's work that helped me figure out what words were common or uncommon. Right. The second thing I remember about Jeanne Chall is she came out. She went westward on the Mass Pike twice to visit us at the University of Albany. And the second time I was running the student reading clinic. So of course having Jeanne show up and advise us about our clinic was a thrill for me. But both times that she showed up, what I also remember is we had a really wonderful catering event. And I don't know if there are any graduate students out there, but you know, the catering event, it's like things are winding down and the vultures start circling about, you know, like what's going to be left, you know, and both times Jeanne came, I just remember eating really richly afterwards. Okay, so what can I say? I have really wonderful academic and food-related memories of Jeanne Chall. Okay, so. Okay, so I call this a précis. I always think I love using précis because it's different, you know. But here's basically what I'm hoping to do with this talk today. I'm going to claim that we know a whole lot about how readers develop, and it turns out that over the last few decades, this knowledge set that we have has become much more broad and much more deep. And I think, in a very beneficial way, our field has gotten input from related fields that have sometimes not been thought of as affiliated, or whose knowledge base has not been accessed and utilized, right? But I don't think that our reading instruction regularly reflects this really robust set of understandings. And that's where I came up with this. I hope this doesn't sound too lame, but the title is, you know, Teaching Reading or Teaching Readers. And I want to move in the direction of teaching readers, which allows me to say we can pay attention to a lot more stuff than we normally do when we think of skills and strategies as the only things that students need, right? Because something that just gets me very sad is when I visit schools and I see second graders who have struggled to learn things that they haven't quite learned, and the remedy to their problem is to have them do it again without anything else support related. And I don't want to sound like a caricature there, but I have seen that happen. Just as I've seen second graders be wonderfully supported by teachers who understand that there's more to reading development than skill and strategy, right? So here's, I'm trying to read, yeah, I guess I can read the one back there. So first we're going to, you're going to do a little reading task in just a few minutes. And then, you know, I know you're thinking Thursday afternoon, Thursday evening, I don't really want to work anymore. But if you do this, you can just sit back, and the chairs are fairly comfortable. You can just doze. And my brother-in-law is here. He has a stick. He's going to go around and just poke people if you start sleeping. Yeah, okay. And then I'm going to talk about not just cognition, which was really my stock in trade for about the first 15 years that I was doing research, but also affect and conation, which I think are areas that we can carefully build into, if they're not already there, our reading instruction. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about a thing called the Matthew effect. And if you're not sure what that is, it goes all the way back to the Gospel of Matthew, and sort of the socialist Merton used it, and then Keith Stanovich used it to describe how good readers get good when they're even in first and second grade, and it's sort of the rich get richer. But I'm going to talk about how we might do that with more kids by paying broad attention to other things. Then I'm going to talk about challenges to the direction that I'd like to see instruction go. And I'm going to pin this mostly on things like testing, and a thing called path dependency, which from economics means maintaining an economic status quo when there are people who can benefit from maintaining the status quo. And then I'll talk briefly about environments that seem to be really good for helping kids develop not only cognitively, but as lifelong enthusiastic readers. And so I don't forget to do this later, I want to mention the Catalyzing Comprehension Through Discussion and Debate group at Harvard, because I've just in the last year agreed to do a synthesis of, I don't know, like 400 papers that have come out of the Reading for Understanding grant from the United States Department of Education. And there are 5 centers that got grants there, and CCDD was one of them. And their work is just wonderful. I really love the work that you're doing, in part because it dovetails or Venn diagrams with some of what I really value. Okay. All right. So, and a bunch of this stuff is from this book that was mentioned earlier. A couple of years ago, it came out, and it's a handbook on individual differences, and there's something like over 25 chapters in it. And the way that I wanted this book to work was to invite people who come from pretty different paradigms, pretty different theoretical perspectives, to talk about how kids vary. And I have to say, I learned so much from this book. I think when you get some really good authors together and you have to read and react to each of their chapters, you can't help but learn. So I was really fortunate to be editor of this. And if you're interested in this book, I would advise, and I don't want Rutledge to hear me say this, but it's expensive. So if you get it from the library, I think that would be a very good thing. So, yeah. I mean, and my royalty is like a 6-pack per book. So so. Doesn't matter. Oh, and my wonderful wife, Marianne, designed the cover. So, and when we sent this to Rutledge, they said, that doesn't look like an educational research handbook. And I said, I know, that's really the point, isn't it? But, and if, I don't know if you picked up on this, these are jingle shells that I don't know if you call them something else in Massachusetts, but they're all the same type of shell, but you can see they vary in size, shape, color, and texture. So that was the individual difference thing, okay? Right, so now I'm gonna ask you to do something related to verbal reporting research, but I wanna give you a little background on it. So back in the late 70s, early 80s, there were these really interesting studies that started out, a lot of it based on work by Erickson, K. Anders Erickson and Herb Simon, and they had this really wonderful piece that came out in 1980 in, I think, Psych Bulletin, and it was called Verbal Reports as Data. And the idea was maybe we could have people talk about what they're doing, and maybe there's some validity to the data. And there are ongoing debates about whether or not verbal reports are a valid source of data, but they seem to have been accepted by a fairly large number of people. And I think they've contributed at least to our understanding of how strategies work. And I'm hoping to prove that claim in just a minute. But what I did related to verbal reports was again, the pre-computer days, I went down into the dusty stacks of the SUNY Albany Library, and I was looking for text that was really difficult, because part of what I was looking at is how do expert readers use strategies. And expert readers typically use strategies very quickly and often automatically. So it's hard for them to talk about something that actually doesn't go through consciousness. It's more of almost a reflex, effortless. So I had to find text that would sort of break down the automaticity that readers were using while still leaving the readers experts, right? So and you'll see one of these texts in just a minute. And I took the subheadings, titles, main ideas out. I took two cassette tape recorders. That, if you go to the Smithsonian, they have these things there on exhibit. It's called a cassette recorder. And I used 2 because once I was doing this, and I had this incredible verbal report from a professor of anthropology, and the recording broke in the middle of it. And you can't really go back and say, you know when you were talking about X? Anyway, so I asked expert readers to talk about what they're doing as they're constructing meaning, right? And then, again, transcribe the tapes and then code the tapes. And there's a little bit of bootstrapping going on at this point where not all of the reading strategies that we now are pretty familiar with were well known. So there was sort of like, is this this? Is this this? And then there's a lot of cross-referencing between theories that were just being built about reading comprehension strategies and things that were being reported, right? All right, so I hope you all got a piece of paper when you checked in. That's a free souvenir. And what I'd like you to do, when I say go, just make believe this is a standardized reading test, right? And when I say stop, you have to stop. But I'd like you to read this paragraph. You can read it on the paper in front of you. And if you could either write down or take mental notes of what you're doing to understand the text, that would be great. So why don't we all start now and read, construct meaning, and remember what you're doing. So you want to move on to the second sentence now? You can. So. And I heard there's a class in here tomorrow morning, so we should try to finish up soon, right? And so if you take, I guess, 1 more minute, that would be great. Okay, so we're always interested in the product of comprehension, but we'll get to the product later. And I'd like to ask anybody who might want to volunteer to tell us what they were doing with this text. This text has been read by thousands of people since 1980, and I'm going to make the claim that there's a fairly predictable set of strategies that readers use with this text, which I think helps build the argument that teaching reading strategies might be a worthwhile thing. All right, so who wants to tell us what they did? Yes?
So I used context clues.
Used context clues?
I understand. I reread things that weren't clear, so I've read the whole thing twice because it's very, very easy.
Okay, so using context and rereading. Okay.
And I broke words down to parts for words I didn't understand first.
Okay. Okay, well, I hit the jackpot with the first person here. This is thank you. That's great. That's great. Yeah.
I did something completely different. I read the first sentence twice, and I only understood Eastern Seaboard, but not the rest of it. So I said, I think I'm going to skim it to see if I get anything else. And I got to the bottom, went kind of slowly, and I got to the bottom, and I was totally confused. So I thought, I'm aware enough to know that I'm not going to understand this.
Okay. All right. Right, right.
You know, I didn't get it, and I know that, I need more context.
Okay, right, right. Which, that's sort of a bailing out strategy, but it's a good one, so. It is, yeah, yeah.
I also was looking for context, so as soon as I saw archaeological,
Yeah.
it started to make sense.
Okay.
As I read through.
Okay.
I still don't understand what the broad point is.
Okay. We will see that in a few minutes. We'll have a reveal. Okay. So, yeah.
The broad point is quite obvious because the last part is
Yeah. There's always somebody like this in the audience.
it's speaking of some kind of tradition that lasts for a long time and that spreads broadly based on a continuity of similar behavior.
Okay. That could be. All right. Well, so let's have 1 or 2 more. Okay.
I try to look for main ideas. What is the sentence about?
Okay.
Trying to find identify.
Did you find?
And definitions. Well, like the broad point using people and quick expansion, archaeological horizon marker. So I was just looking for what is the sentence talking about.
Okay.
And if there's any definition embedded in the text of terms.
Okay, great. And last, over there.
So I was zooming in and zooming out. I was like, did a quick scan, then I tried to zoom in on terminologies that might give me a key to understand the concept,
Right.
Looking for definitions, clarifications. So,
I like that, zooming in and zooming out. Okay. Okay. All right, so let me, here's what, over the decades when I've used this text, what people have reported doing strategically. And I'm sure that you'll see yourself in this list. It's, it's a mix of metacognitive strategies, a mix of meaning-seeking findings, meaning-seeking strategies, and I think what I like about this text, it does break things down for us, and I think it helps us realize how strategic we can be. And often when we read, it's not this challenging, but we are using some subset of these strategies to make sense. I also like the fact that this reminds us that fluency is situational, and that the idea that we're going to read everything quickly and get it right is kind of nonsensical. Did anybody do something that's not on this list? Because I always like, it's a living document. I like to add to it. Yeah.
This is hard to explain, but I read through and all of that, and then there was a moment where I sort of stopped, and then all of a sudden the thing popped out of me, because I have friends who are archaeologists, and I must have talked with them about Flint using cultures.
Okay.
And so it wasn't illogical, it was just a kind of game.
Well, you can thank your friends next time you talk with them about maybe one of the few people who got this paragraph. Okay, and one more.
Rearranging the order of the text?
Did that help? Or?
Because you get to the heart of it, which explains what a horizon is, and then you need to go back and then forward and up and down, and so reading it once in order, and then again out of order.
Okay, all right. Okay. And one other thing that people do that's not in this list, we're all, I think, pretty comfortable calling up an academic journal schema, and we do that automatically when we start reading things like this, right? So I want to say that it looks like reading strategies are pretty widespread. I hope this helps make the point. They're often predictable in nature, given the list that I had up there and given your report. They're clearly related to reading success, or in the case of your paragraph reading, not so much. But you invite me and I insult you. I'm sorry, but yeah, it was a good strategic attempt. They're generally a good thing to have. And then if you're familiar with the most recent strategy stuff that's coming out of research, it focuses on things like how do kids make sense of multiple texts? How do they come up with main ideas in one text and then synthesize across text? How do they weight and value things from different texts? How do they come up with an account that reconciles different viewpoints on the same maybe historical event, things like that. And also things like determining the trustworthiness, the reliability of the source. Boy, we sure do need that, right, with all this fake news around, and navigating internet reading, of course, right? So I think strategies are good, but here's, I need to lean over and read this. Strategies, I think, have come into this basket of things that include vocabulary instruction, fluency instruction, phonics instruction, phonemic awareness, that ends up being stuff that we teach kids. And that's all well and good, because kids do need all of those things to be successful readers, but I'm not sure that it's enough. And I'm not sure that it's an optimal blend of skill and strategy and the other things like support, positive motivation, positive self-efficacy that kids need. So we'll work into that in just a minute. So here's some other things. Like over the years when I've used this paragraph, people report other things, even though I asked them to talk about strategies. And you might see yourself here also, and not that I asked you to report these things, but I'm guessing most of the people in this room are like, I'm up for the reading challenge. I'm here. And it's a reading lecture, and I kind of have my high regard for myself as a reader, right? And then things like self-efficacy. You can walk away tonight and not feel eternally damaged by this paragraph, because you were set up for all this, and it was to help prove a point. The epistemological stance is an important thing to look at, because you can't really do much than receive knowledge from this text, because most of us don't have any prior knowledge to accept or challenge what an author is giving us. And the last one, the annoyance that a guest speaker would drop this task on anyone kind enough to attend his talk. Right? So let's go to cognition, affect, and conation. And these are dictionary definitions of those words, because I think it's important to be clear about how I view them. Right. And we know these things are intertwined in all acts of cognition. Right. Well, probably not like microscopic attention-related things. We might not have a lot of emotion related to some visual perceptions, but here's where we're going, all right? So I'm going to argue cognitive strategies and skills are important, but they're not enough for most readers, and certainly they're not enough for most developmental readers. Strategies and skills don't predict or explain readers' success or failure, unless, of course, you're only looking at a reading test. Then you would say, yeah, it's just skill or strategy that's giving you what you've got to, all right? And these limited conceptions of what matters in reading and reading development really constrain instruction and the types of learning and activities that kids are involved in, right? So this is even harder to read than that Jeanne Chall thing, but this is a NAEP chart that looks at a significant difference based on the free and reduced meal status of children. Of course, the bottom line would be the children who are coming from poverty, who don't get a solid diet every day. And we could look at that, and a lot of people do look at that and say those kids in the bottom, to get that achievement gap closed, to get rid of it, they need more skill and strategy instruction. And I believe they need more skill and strategy instruction, but they need something else, all right? So how each reader approaches, begins, works through, and completes acts of reading is influenced by not just an array of factors, but the interaction of these factors, all right? Okay, so as my daughters would say, BTW, by the way, a broad point's an arrowhead. So, and isn't Google wonderful for a teaching aid? You know, you could just, there are 20,000 people who have arrowhead collections, who have pictures of them on, if you want to use them, right? So I want to go back in time now to show you that what I'm talking about is something that people have been noticing and describing in reading research for almost a century. And the fact that this has been going on but not so much attention paid to it is problematic, I believe, right? So here's Moore in 1938 talking about the things that we can look to within individuals that may vary. So you can read that for yourselves. I like in physical equipment. That's it's such a quaint old saying, right? And Emmett Betts in 1940, as typical pupil becomes increasingly frustrated, he may exhibit tension, movements of the body, hands, and feet. He may frown and squint, and he may exhibit other types of emotional behavior characteristic of a frustrated individual. You know, and if that's true, and I think anyone who's worked with struggling readers knows that this is true, more skill and strategy, pure version, is not the right answer. Okay. And then in 1961, Ruth Strang was talking about her view of how we're continually evolving in our understanding of reading and its development. Right? I want to especially pay attention to the last sentence. The reader's memory of each experience with reading further influences her perception of and his response to each new situation. So if we, glom onto that, things like self-efficacy and motivation, we know the importance of, if things are not going positively, even though they may have in the past, we can see drastic changes. And here's Hunt in 52 writing about first graders. Kids differing in language facility, knowledge of stories, experiences with materials, visual discrimination, general information, and attitudes towards reading in school. And I've saved the best for last because you can read this and think, I guess they probably didn't have an I or a B set up in 1938. frowning, squirming and pointing tensely, labored breathing, grunting, whispering, and even weeping, which that's a bad reading session, right? So, yeah, right. So over the last 80, 90 years, there have been people who've been paying attention to the fact that it's not all about cognition. It's important to pay attention to other things, right? And so I think these quotes also remind us there's a precedent for looking at these things, and probably should give us a reason to be concerned that there isn't more attention in some classrooms and in some reading materials to this other side of the cognitive skill and strategy coin. So now I want to move into the Matthew effect. Again, the Matthew effect is in the Gospel of Matthew, related to a parable about the rich getting richer. Sociologist Merton in the 50s took this to describe what happens in some societies about the rich getting richer. He could be writing in 2018. And then Keith Stanovich in 1986 took this idea and looked at kid readers who were experiencing exponential growth. So these are children, second, third grade, who you've probably seen these, or it's been you. It's like off to the races reading. You can't be held back. And what he looked at was the fact that kids who have initial success with vocabulary and comprehension are building a sort of self-sustaining, self-extending system, because the more you read and comprehend, the more vocabulary words you get, and the more vocabulary words you get, the more comprehension. You know, so a bit of a chicken and the egg there, but the idea is the more you read, the better you get at it. And he looked only at vocabulary and comprehension, right? And he talked about how this might be a partial explanation of why, even in first and second grade, we start seeing some drastic separation between the struggling readers and very accomplished readers. Right? Basically, the accomplished readers have everything going for them. Everything is working. All of their cognitive, affective, conative needs are being met. And it may be the reverse for the struggling readers. Okay. And so what I'd like to propose is, let's take this vocabulary helps comprehension, and comprehension helps vocabulary, and drop in things like motivation, metacognition, and self-efficacy. Because there are studies out there, there are not a lot of them, but they're starting, that show that there are interrelationships, significant interrelationships between things like doing well in reading and increased self-efficacy. And then self-efficacy helping a kid be an even better reader, right? When we think about the Matthew effect, I mentioned this just 10 seconds ago, we've got to think about the reverse Matthew effect. A fourth grader who has been in the low reading group could be 10 years old, and counting kindergarten, that fourth grader may have been in 5 years in a row of, or half her or his life, of a failing reading situation. Right? And so to just drop strategies and skills on this child and think that everything will be okay is misguided. Right? And I just want to briefly go over what a couple of slides that I think demonstrate the power of these factors. I'm pulling 3 factors out here: motivation, self-efficacy, and metacognition. Here's just some findings. I had the privilege of working with John Guthrie at Maryland for about 15 years. And he, of course, was Mr. Reading Motivation, and so I learned a lot from him. I mean, he was a motivated reader, but he also did a lot of research on motivation and reading. Right? Look at the second one. The effect of reading instruction on reading achievements mediated by a student's reading motivation. Well, of course, and a good teacher knows that, but it's really nice to have the research that backs up that belief or fact at this point. Right? These 2 quotes, I think, are incredibly important. And let's start with the bottom one. Jim Cummins does a lot of work with English language learners and with economically disadvantaged children. What he has found is that the negative effects of socioeconomic disadvantage can be pushed back, in part, when kids are actively engaged with literacy. And, you know, that seems to be one of our society's greatest failings right now, which is to try to find the way to help all the children who continue to fail from certain demographic groups. How can we help them not fail any longer? And so the idea that we might have children engaged in reading and reading activities, it makes a lot of sense to me. Right? Self-efficacy and agency. So Bandura is I think just a wonderful, the grandfather of self-efficacy. When my daughters were growing up, I asked them if they would needlepoint this and we could put it on the mantle, and neither of them, even with payment. But anyway, I think this, if you read this, it might be hard to relate to what some kids go through with reading. So what I like to think about is the Department of Motor Vehicles. We, as adults, I think, one of our privileges, we can opt out of a lot of situations where we don't feel like we're in control. Like we can manage our lives and structure our daily routines so that we don't run into a lot of things where we feel helpless or not in control. So that's when I think about Department of Motor Vehicles. I don't know how things are in Massachusetts, but have you ever been in Department of Motor Vehicles and you stand on line to be told what line to stand on? And then somebody gives you a document and it's the wrong document, but you don't know until you've stood on the second line and you get there. So, yeah. So I think a lot of kids might feel that way when they're in a reading group where things are not working out. That's the closest I can come to. Right. But the italics there, unless people believe they can produce desired effects by their actions, they have little incentive to act or to persevere in the face of difficulties. And if you look at some readers who are not progressing well, what you also see is lack of attention, being off task, being disruptive. And to me, that's not surprising, in part if you look at what Bandura is telling us about self-efficacy. Right? If you compare children with high self-efficacy and children with low self-efficacy, the differences are fairly stark and have important consequences for learning or not learning. And here are some of them. If you're not familiar, performance orientation, which you associate with low self-efficacy kids, is like, do I have the look and feel of somebody who's doing okay, as opposed to a learning orientation, which is, am I learning something, right? So some kids will take on this persona of doing well, like, oh yeah, I got it, I understand, they smile and they nod, and they give the look of knowing, but knowing might be the furthest thing from their accomplishments. And metacognition, this is very strange to me, that the literature on metacognition is decades old. It existed before we called it metacognition. I think we called it thoughtfulness, the ability to reflect. And it is so important, not just in every academic aspect, but in life. And yet we don't really focus on it in school. It's almost like an orphan. And I'm not quite sure why that is. But without metacognition, we're not able to independently and successfully take on a task, work through a task, and complete the task, and then reflect on it, right? What we normally do is we infer that metacognition is working from a successful task, right? So if a kid reads well and answers comprehension questions, or builds a diorama about the characters in a scene from a story, we're assuming metacognition worked. But in terms of diagnosing whether or not metacognition is as great as it could be or still needs a little help, we're not always that good, right? So I think this is an area where we could do a lot more work. Here's how Burkowski and Turner define metacognition. Right? And it turns out to be a very, very powerful driver, as I said. I like to also go back to Palingsar and Brown's work in the 1980s. They worked with special ed middle school students. If you've ever worked with special ed middle school students, you know that they're a quite challenging group. They were able to learn metacognitive strategies through reciprocal teaching, where teachers did a lot of modeling, explanation, and demonstrating of strategies. They also sometimes thought aloud about the strategies that they were using. Okay. Right. So to tie this back up, and these are questions that think of when I was a classroom teacher, and I don't ever recall thinking, wow, Jimmy went from the 60th percentile to the 80th percentile on the state test. It was more like, did Jimmy come into the classroom never wanting to read, and then Jimmy left wanting to pick up a book from time to time? So I think that's a very valid measure. It's a little different from percentiles, right? All right, so I want to go from that to what would instruction look like? What would curriculum look like if we're sold on the idea that we need to bring in more than skill and strategy to the instruction of reading, right? So one thing would be just to do a quick balance of a published curriculum or a homegrown curriculum, and also to do a quick inventory on a daily basis of what am I touching upon, what are my goals. And so on the right-hand column here, we've got the old standbys, and I combined phonics and phonemic awareness under word recognition. But on the left-hand side would be things that maybe there are ways to build these in if they're not already there, that are, I would say, not just suitable, but necessary aspects of good reading instruction. And these would be our, the work that I do with NAEP and the Common Core, a lot of it's about cognitive targets, like what do we want a child to be able to do? What do we want an adolescent reader to be able to do as a result of meeting a particular standard, as a result of learning this set of things? And if we take that idea but transfer it to conation and affect, we can have these sorts of outcomes that I think are as valuable. They're a nice counterpart to cognitive skill and strategy growth. And I think a way to think about this, when I work with my undergrads at the University of Maryland, the zone of proximal development becomes, I think, a fairly handy way of thinking about individual students' development and where they can go next, and how our instruction can help them traverse the space between what I can do and what I can do next. And I think David Pearson, was David here last year or 2 years ago? Well, David talks about the gradual release of responsibility, which is how can a teacher start doing everything in describing maybe a prediction strategy, and then over a couple of weeks hand that strategy off to the student because there's been enough modeling, discussion, and demonstration of how prediction works and how it's valuable, and here's a text that's very predictable, so why don't you try it? And I think that we might try the same thing, zone of proximal development, for things that are not cognitive, which would mean how do we know where a child is developing high self-efficacy? Where do we know where they are related to motivation? And how do we know how metacognitive they are? So this becomes a little more difficult because the diagnostic tools that we have to help us understand where children are from a cognitive skill and strategy perspective are way more developed, and they're more finely tuned than this stuff that we have to do motivation and engagement. Right? And that's, I think, another area where in the next couple of decades we might get some really good work. If you're familiar with some of the things that are out there, I mean, they're kind of charming. There's one called the Elementary Reading Attitude Survey, and the guy who developed it happened to be a friend of the cartoonist who did Garfield. So there are these Garfield cartoons, and there's a smiling Garfield and a frowning Garfield, and you ask kids to circle these things, reflecting their attitude towards reading, right? Which, it's fine, but it's not as fine-grained, I think, as we might move towards. Right. Okay, and can I ask how much time we have left before Q&A? Hal? Oh, we're okay. Some of you got that. Okay, thanks. Right. If you haven't seen 2001: Space Odyssey, not for that, but it is a pretty interesting movie, right? So, and this is from the RAND study group, which Catherine Snow led, now 16 years ago. But the thing that I italicized there, I think, is a good sort of short of thumbnail to describing what a teacher can do in relation not to just strategy and skill, but to these other things that we've been focused on. And then in the work that I've been reviewing for the National Academy of Education, this would be all of the studies that came out of the Reading for Understanding initiative. I just want to go over a few things that have stood out to me as really, really wonderful. And I'll start at the bottom, okay, because that just seems right. Problem-based learning is a means of, I would say, surrounding acts of reading with meaningful tasks. And one of the things that we don't always do well is ask kids to use what they read in a way that would be engaging. You know, we often end up having kids do comprehension for comprehension's sake, meaning read something and I'll ask you some questions so that you can demonstrate whether or not you got comprehension going for yourself. And that's okay, except that's only something that happens in schools, really. I mean, we don't read books and then like we go to a book club and somebody says, what happened on page 20 in your own words? Or 500 words, or something like that. And so problem-based learning, where you take what could be a challenging reading task, but fold it into something that a child cares about. You know, it might be about pets, it might be about the environment, it might be about a sibling, it might be about family dynamics, it might be about better school lunches. That's the typical one. But so problem-based learning is something that engages students. It tends to get motivation ratcheted up, which is always good. Another thing that I liked about this group of studies is a lot of the work starts with design studies, which, how can I do this quickly? Design studies typically engage not just university researchers, but school personnel, and sometimes school personnel to the level of teachers, and sometimes students. And everyone is at the table talking about what would be some worthwhile goals, what are some realistic goals. And through iterations of a study, you might get to year 3 before you figure out what exactly you want to be focused on. But I like design studies because they acknowledge that things take time, and that often the timelines that school change and that school research are operating on are much too compressed to expect anything but sort of surface level change. Okay. The studies have also, to a study pretty much, demonstrated how important teachers' professional development will be in designing classrooms that help us focus on strategy, skill, affect, and conation. And in part, it's because what pre-service teachers get as their education, and in part it's about whether or not they're supported once they get to school. So that's the perennial professional development challenges. But when it comes to things like, if you're a 4th grade teacher and you're not familiar with something like, how does epistemological knowledge develop, and when are kids ready to challenge an author, you can't really be a good teacher of kids whose epistemological development, I love being able to say that without fault, epistemological development. That'll be it for tonight. And how can you be a good teacher if you're not quite sure, or you're not really solid on what that means and what you can do for kids? So that turns out to be really important. All right, let's go to the next one. So I do a lot of work with assessment, and as I mentioned earlier, this is a place where we could really benefit from some valid, reliable, I don't want to say easy to administer, because I think most assessments that are easy to administer are very limited in what they can tell us. But it might be that we get some decent assessments that sort of elbow their way into the cognitive strategy and skill assessments and say, you know, it's our time to shine, and let us have a little space here, a little time. Who knows? Right. So this is a tough part, because I think the challenges to focusing on teaching readers are in part a reflection of the challenges that a lot of schools and teachers face throughout the country. I'm thinking in part of, if you follow some of the reporting that's going on in the state of Oklahoma, it shows you the books that the children are using. And I'm not a big fan of kids only using textbooks, but when the textbook that you're reading is talking about in the future we might be able to communicate electronically, I'm not sure what to say, but it's funny, but it's sadder than it is funny, right? So testing in the status quo. I don't know if any of you guys do this, but I kind of like to spend time on the internet doing this. I go to State Department of Education, and that's weird, I know. But anyway, I look to see, like, what are states saying about the general goals of education, and then how are they conceptualizing how they would support moving kids towards the goals that they publicly state on the web page, the homepage of the state ed website. And I'm not picking on California in particular. This is just an example. I kind of like this. It's like, together as a team, we prepare students to live, work, and thrive in a highly connected world. And I'm like, that must be an awesome curriculum. I wonder how you measure kids' progress towards this wonderful thing. So here's, on the same site, but a different click-through, this is how the state of California proposes to measure whether or not kids are going to work, live, and thrive in interconnected communities, which to me it looks like a whole lot of content area testing. Does anyone see something different there? And I didn't splice this. I mean, this is the whole menu. It's like... Okay. So that might be the fact that legislators passed the bill. And, when the legislators pass bills, they might not have read the lofty goal statement of the state education department. Or there might have been some backroom lobbying going on. Okay, and it's not only states. I mean, we're in the habit of thinking that if you're not doing well with strategies and skills, then the remedy is more strategy and skill instruction. And on top of that, if you've had the chance to become familiar with the National Reading Panel report, if your research got into that report, it's because it met a standard for quasi-experimental or experimental design for your research. And if you look at studies that do that, you know that the way that they prove significant differences is they look at test scores. They compare test scores, right? And if you look at reading first, the outcomes of reading first were kids who got treatment in extensive phonics instruction did much better on phonics tests than the kids in the control groups. But when it came to reading comprehension, there were no significant differences between the reading first treatment and the control groups, right? But that's where the federal government put its money, put its dough. It was like, reading first was over $1 billion, okay? And I'm concerned that these initiatives, I think they're well-intentioned. They help a lot of publishing companies, too. They may do more harm than good for some students, right? And this middle part is really important. I think it's important to understand how in the DNA of reading and reading instruction assessment is. When we use reading test scores as dependent variables in research all the time. And so, how do you get away from that? How do you prove significance or lack of significance without a standardized reading test score? And you can do that, but it's really hard to get government funding if you want to do it in an alternative way. And it's also the way that schools and districts and states measure adequate yearly progress. It's on a standardized reading test. And finally, when the government gets into helping you rate or does its own job of rating what works turns out to be programs that help raise standardized reading test scores and nothing else. So it would be nice to have some other indicator, some other evidence, I think, introduced when teachers and schools and districts are considering what's a good program for my kids, for our kids. And so I know Mary Beth and Pamela, who are in the audience, are both a former and current colleague on NAEP reading framework with me. And the NAEP is a large-scale test. I would hope it's not too consequential. But I think this is a really telling quote. This is back from 1987 when the year results were being released. And I'm sure you've run into stuff like this. I'm forgetting the guy who, he passed away a few years ago, but he used to write about all the stuff that tests don't test, like resilience and community dedication and friendship and compassion, things like that. But this gets at it, and this is a bit of a sad statement, I think. It's almost a statement of resignation, but it doesn't have to be that way, and I'm hoping that it isn't, right? Okay. Oh, and then, by the way, we're getting towards the end, so you guys should all start smiling, like a happy Garfield face, right? But so in economics, there's a term path dependency, and path dependency is an economist term for describing a status quo. And it turns out in the United States, there are plenty of corporations who are very happy with the status quo. If you follow the escapades of the larger testing companies, and if you ever take a look at the balance sheets and the amount of money that is made in testing in the United States, it's fairly astounding. It's also the case that testing is the largest unregulated business in the United States, as far as I can tell. Right. There are other things that are dangerous, they have to be tested and regulated, but not testing. And an opportunity cost, which is if states and the federal government are demanding that you do adequate yearly progress measures, and your state saying you've got to do this in every grade, no child left behind, grades 3 through 8, that costs money, and the money that costs can't be used somewhere else. That's what opportunity cost is. My 4th grade daughter, Rowan, when she was 4, explained it this way: if I go to the store and I buy an ice cream pop, I can no longer get candy. So it's she had her head on the right things, right? So, and the last thing is, I don't know if you're familiar with this term, psychosclerosis or hardening of the categories, and that is, we get habitual. We do things sometimes without reflecting on whether or not we could do them differently, right? So everyone's favorite slides, it's the C word, conclusions, right? So. I'd say that right now, a lot of reading instruction reflects the idea of teaching reading, but not teaching readers. And I've suggested that just broadening the concept of what children need to become enthusiastic lifelong readers is worth our time and effort. And I've tried to provide some evidence to support the idea that motivation, self-efficacy, metacognition are important. There was a while ago this idea, well, research needs to get a critical mass before we want to put our efforts behind what research is saying. Well, we're way past the point where we have established critical mass in the areas of metacognition and self-efficacy and motivation and engagement. It's a done deal. We know how powerful these constructs are. We know that they interact with things like strategy and skill development. Right? The lack of breadth and conceptualization of what readers need, I think, really is detrimental to their reading development and their reading health. Right? And I would, especially at the Jeanne Chall lecture, I would never say that skills and strategies are not important. I'd urge people to think about sharing the stage, having people come up standing next to cognitive skills and strategies. That would be a great play, right? In elementary school, somebody could be cognitive skills and strategies and then self-efficacy. And it would be so cute, wouldn't it? But anyway. All right. Yeah, and so I focused on reading, but all of what I've said, if any of it's true, it holds true for all other aspects of academics. It holds true in mathematics, language arts, history, social studies, and probably even the arts themselves. Who wants to play saxophone if they don't think that they can turn into the next John Coltrane, right? So, okay, so that's my email address, and if anybody wants to email me, just put in the messaging like Jeanne Chall talk, because I keep getting messages from this guy in Nigeria who I sent him my bank information, and he still hasn't sent me the money, but. In any case, again, thank you very much. If there are any questions, we have some microphones, and I'd be happy to listen to your question. I don't know if I can answer them, but I'll listen. Thank you again. Hi.
Thank you so much for the wonderful talk.
Sure.
So just now you mentioned the motivation, self-efficacy in reading. I'm curious, how is this self-efficacy motivation reading compared with self-efficacy motivation in other disciplines or other subjects like in math or science or playing video games? Do you think they are like fundamentally the same or different? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I'd be the first to claim I'm not an expert in things outside of reading, but I believe that there are very similar mechanisms and processes that would be going on. Okay.
So what do you think make the self-efficacy and motivation reading so unique? And because we know like cognitive skills are different in different areas, but the motivation and self-efficacy in reading, do you think what would be the uniqueness in that?
Well, I think the amount of time that we spend in reading in school it helps make it, I don't know unique, but it makes it prominent in that if we're not feeling strong about our reading and if we're not motivated and engaged in our reading as we're learning to read, then when the handoff goes to the content areas like history or science, I would not have high expectations for children who haven't become efficacious as readers or motivated. So,
thank you.
Sure. Thanks. Hi.
Thank you for your wonderful lecture.
Well, and thanks for volunteering your strategy.
You talk about teaching readers instead of reading and focusing on individuality and needs of different readers. I wonder, and I'm curious to hear your considerations about English learners, as they also have their own needs, and you might have some considerations to share with us about teaching English learners.
Yeah, well, if you take the idea of the more we can pay attention to the individual learner, the better our chances of success and long-lasting learning. So you're asking to introduce all of the variables that being an English language learner bring. And, I think that one of the challenges there is the number of teachers who understand, kids going back and forth, toggling back and forth between the first language and the second language. What kind of scaffolding is appropriate under what conditions for such learners are things that I don't think get enough attention in teacher education courses. So, and I'd say the materials that I know are, and I'm not an EL, you can tell I'm not an EL specialist at all, but I think there are good materials out there, but I think the materials in the teacher's hands are the important thing, and it's how do you know where a child's coming from on Tuesday, and which language to work with, and what goals to set, whether it's a mixed ability group, a mixed ability within one language, or if it's mixed ability across two languages or more than two languages. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but it complexifies the idea of addressing individual differences, certainly.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks. Oh, the one who gave up. Okay.
I teach middle school.
Okay.
I'm a reading teacher in the middle school. So you said there's a knowledge base to back up what you were talking about, yet educators don't dismiss, not sure what happens, but we don't use that knowledge base that is out there. I'm curious either why you think that's true or what can be, and not just about those things that you talked about. I teach the most struggling readers, and there's a huge knowledge base about good ways to address that, but
Right.
it's depending on who you talk to, there's not a lot of understanding of that knowledge at the ground level.
Right. Well, yeah, and I should back up a bit and say that I'm sure everyone in this room can think about wonderful teachers they've had who were totally about not just cognition, but about providing support, providing challenge that help build self-efficacy in a honest way, not in a puffery way, and that help children become motivated for whatever subject they were teaching. And to me, it's just, again, to go back to undergraduate teacher preparation. For example, in reading, it's fairly common for a pre-service elementary ed class to have a textbook that has 14 chapters that sort of match with the 14 classes during a semester. And you might get a half of a chapter that focuses on motivation and engagement, or a third of a chapter. And so if students reading that book take page space as a proxy for the importance of things that I'm being asked to learn, it's second or third class citizenship that these things are getting. I do believe that that's changed. I mean, I think the apogee of skill and strategy might have been 10 or 15 years ago, and hopefully it's declining, not in importance, but it's being met at another level with people assigning importance to things like, how do we help kids become motivated? And if you work with middle school readers, I know I did once too, in Saratoga Springs Junior High School, and that was the hardest job I ever had. It was, especially the motivation part. So, yeah. So I don't know if that's an answer, but.
I also work with kids who are dyslexic,
Uh-huh.
and I feel like there are segments of the reading world that dismiss the need to address that. And so I get, new fifth graders all the way through. I have an eighth grader right now who really hasn't been, he struggles so much because he can't read the words. On top of all those other things that you talked about,
Right.
do all those, but also help him read the words.
Right.
I feel like the field, I feel a sense of the ILA, I just read a statement by them recently that essentially dismissed the knowledge base in dyslexia.
Right.
I don't understand why that happens.
Well, I think that harks back to Jeanne Chall also in the reading wars, like what's the best way to teach reading? So that's a nice way to honor her this evening. Yeah, I think, how can we put this? What is mandated or sanctioned or heavily recommended by the powers that be still tends to be cognitive skill and strategy. And it traces through pre-service teaching. It sometimes traces through master's reading specialist programs. And it's to me a movement that hasn't quite caught on as well as it should. Yeah.
I'm the activated prior knowledge person.
Oh, you're the person who knows about flints and has friends that. Yeah.
But I know that's called activating prior knowledge.
Yes.
And that's what we're supposed to do.
Yes.
So I'm curious about social class differences, specifically with parents. I'm curious if you've done any research, or know others who've done research on parents' conceptions of what reading by social class, on parents' conceptions of what reading strategies will be the most effective for their individual children.
I'm not familiar with research on that, and I could give you a few anecdotes. I get concerned about assigning, certain types of behaviors to certain groups, but I do recall a study, it's called retrospective miscue analysis, where researchers and teachers have sat down with parents and they go over child's running records, for example. And this happened to be with poor parents. A number of the poor parents were focused on reading accuracy as the prime indicator of whether or not their child was a good reader, which is... Accuracy is great, but it's not. They weren't focused on fluency. They would be more happy if the kids struggled to accurately pronounce single words and not be fluent than if they were fluent and every once in a while mispronounced a word. So I think that's an area that's very interesting, but very prone to individual differences amongst parents, because they'll be reacting to and interpreting their kids' behaviors based on their value system, which is going to be variable.
Yeah, I agree with you about not stereotyping, but I guess what I'm also thinking in our I direct a teacher preparation program, in our courses for elementary teachers and reading teachers, whether or not we're doing enough with them about communicating the varieties of strategies for individual learners to parents.
Yeah.
And so I guess that's what I'm hoping to see as well.
Yeah, so if you see me after...
And I agree about stereotypes.
Yeah. So one of my doctoral students a few years ago, her name's Maria Crassus, her dissertation was in emergency housing and involving parents in their kids' literacy development.
Ooh, okay.
And so if you see me, I can, and I could, she's a very giving person, so she would probably talk to you on the internet. And,
thank you.
Okay.
And thank you for a very interesting talk.
Oh, well, thank you for coming. Thanks. Hello.
Hi. I was really intrigued by what you said, or you alluded to some work that's being done now on developing assessments for affect and conation, self-efficacy. I'd love to hear more about that, and I'd love to hear more about what you and other leaders in the field who have bigger voices than I do are doing to try and change the current assessment landscape that we have. So, thanks.
Okay, so, I'd say there are some very useful surveys that are out in the public domain now. You don't even have to pay for them. In relation to motivation and engagement, there's a thing called the Motivation to Read Profile, MRP. Gambrell is the first author of that, and it's been through a few revisions, and it's been scaled up and down to elementary school and high school. The types of questions there are like, when do you like to read? Where do you like to read? What types of things do you like to read? How do you view yourself as a reader? And those are important questions to ask. They seem to me to be entry-level questions. They're the kind of questions that, as a teacher, I'd really want to get more information about. That the question gets me into the area that I'm going to be digging for more information. I think for large-scale testing or assessment or evaluation of these things, testing companies will have to view them as worthwhile. And I see a little bit of getting the foot in the door. PISA now has motivation questionnaires that accompany the international assessments of reading that are given. And NAEP is starting to think about incorporating some aspect of motivation and engagement into some of the tasks that it's using. But it's I don't know. Things take time again there, and again, it's that economic factor that is a wild card usually. Well, whew, okay. Any other questions? Great. Well, thank you again. Thank you again.
Thank you, Dr. Afflerbach. So now I have the distinct privilege of welcoming my colleague, Paola Uccelli, to the stage so that she can help present the Doctoral Student Research Award.
Thank you, Alex. And welcome, Shireen. So Shireen Al-Adeimi has been selected to receive, can people hear me? Yes. Has been selected to receive the Jeanne Chall Doctoral Student Award, which is here. Oh, okay. The award. Okay. Shireen's dissertation is titled Talking to Learn, Investigating the Relationship Between Classroom Discussion and Persuasive Writing. And to analyze classroom talk, Shireen transcribed literally hundreds of discussions in 43 middle school classrooms, and she used an innovative observation tool that she developed in collaboration with Kathy O'Connor, who is in the audience, actually. So after detailed linguistic and quantitative analysis, she found this, that highly dialogic discussions that were led by teachers were indeed associated with essays of higher quality. Interestingly, though, when the discussions were more dialogic, but were only among students without the teacher leading, she did not find the same positive findings. So Shireen's results advanced the field by providing new methods and nuanced distinctions to further examine classroom talk and how best to promote it for meaningful learning. At GSE, Shireen contributed to the learning of so many. She was a popular TF in multiple courses. She co-taught a graduate course in literacy, language, and culture that was a big hit. And she was a beloved doctoral peer who was selected as her class commencement marshal due to her leadership, involvement, and service to the community. And yet, if you search Shireen in the internet, you'd actually discover another side of her. You'd find her in her role as an activist, with vocal, honest, eye-opening reports about the terrible ongoing civil war happening now in Yemen, her country of origin. Shireen speaks up so that everyone she can reach knows and remembers that Yemen has become the world's worst humanitarian crisis. That's the United Nations description. Yemen has between 75 and 80% of its people in need of humanitarian aid every day. So besides her insightful research, we all need to learn from Shireen about the needs and the suffering of her extended family and the people of Yemen. So please find her in Twitter, NBC, and many other social media and share her stories widely. But in addition to her activism, Shireen is now assistant professor at Michigan State University, where she continues her research on dialogic practices to improve learning, particularly focusing on culturally and linguistically diverse classrooms. We are so happy to have you back on campus, Shireen, to celebrate your mind, your hard work, and your heart. So please join me in congratulating Shireen Al-Adeimi. Are we ready now to go to the reception, or Alex will say 2 words, perhaps?
Thank you all for coming tonight. I hope you're ready to have some good snacks and some good drinks, and I hope you'll join me upstairs at the Elliott Lyman Room. And again, the elevator and stairs are off here to your left.